Did anybody have interesting stories? Maybe I'll pause the recorder so we get some. All right, then let's resume recording. So welcome to class. We had a little bit of a break, even though this class technically wasn't affected by the Easter break officially, right? We had the pre-recorded lecture, so hopefully you guys were all able to find that. It was, kind of half a class. And I think I explained this last time. It was because I teach two sections and the other section was canceled this week. So I had to kind of keep things in sync. So I thought just doing the pre-recorded lecture was the easiest way to do that. And I gave you the option, you didn't have to do it, of watching the Knock Knock movie. So if you wanted the full class experience, you could watch that movie. You still can watch that movie for extra credit. Maybe we can look at a syllabus. So we are on top of dates and stuff. What is that? I think there's something going on with my Adobe. I'll mess with that later. So here's where we are. We're at week 11. And that means next week we got an exam. I just emailed you about that like less than an hour ago. And I gave you a review sheet. And that means nobody will probably have any questions right now. We could look at that together too. Maybe that's what I'll do is I'll open that up next. But it also means we can have a review session later in the week. How does that sound? So last time we did that, and I think a few folks showed up. Not that many showed up, but I do pay attention to the YouTube stats, and that is one of my more watched videos. So people did watch the video even if they weren't able to show up. So maybe I'll float this out now. We've got not the whole class, but a lot of people are here. When should we do the review session? Last time it was on a Friday afternoon. Does that still work for people? Friday afternoon, kind of, sort of? I mean, we could do it like on the weekend, but that feels wrong. So let's not do that. The alternative would be earlier, but earlier is probably not going to work. Or we could do it on Monday. Is that crazy? That's like the day before the exam. What do you prefer, Friday or Monday? Do we have class Thursday? We don't have class Thursday, but you might have other classes. Friday or Monday. Because I teach other classes Thursday, I teach other classes Monday, but I could squeeze it in like at 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock, like kind of in the morning-ish, or even on Monday night. But I feel like Friday is probably best for people, right? Can't make it Friday, but it'd be nice to watch. Okay, yeah, so let's try to for Friday, and then again, if people can't make it, then they'll have time to catch up on it over the weekend, like Greg said. Tomorrow is Monday's schedule, but yeah, today is Tuesday's schedule, so we're not affected by that. But yeah, for your other classes, tomorrow is a weird day. I usually have tomorrow free of no courses, but tomorrow I will have a very full day, and then Thursday I'll also have a very full day. So this week is going to be crazy, basically starting right now. But we had a week off. I think we'll be able to handle it. So we do not have class Thursday. Aiden, we never have class Thursday. You're confusing this class with another class. This class only meets once a week, Steven.
Are we gonna have like a class like last time?
Yes, we will. Yeah. So there'll be the Rita Gross article, Helping the Iron Bird, is pretty short. How many pages is that? 14. So it shouldn't be too onerous to get through. But it's sort of interesting. It'll be on the exam. It won't be on the exam in a big way, but it'll be on there. And it ties in with things we're talking about this week. So really what we're doing today and the Rita Gross article come together pretty nicely. Okay, so why don't we nail it down? Friday, what did we do last time? Like 2 o'clock? I know a lot of people can't make it at 2 o'clock, but can some people make it? Because if nobody's there, then I'll be very lonely and it won't be very interesting. So should we say Friday, 2 p.m.? Does that work for people? We can do earlier. We could do Friday morning, or we do later. I don't want to do too late though, because then that bleeds into Friday night, and we don't want to do that. Vaccinated now, people. I need my Friday nights. 2 p.m., 3 p.m. What do you guys want? 11 p.m. or no, 11 a.m. I mean. All right, Steven's free. Who has conflicts on Friday but still want to come? Can we record the session on Friday like last time? Yes, we can, Walter. But we need some people to be there. So somebody needs to take one for the team and be my conversation partner. Because otherwise, again, I'm gonna bounce. Okay. So 2 to 3 is sounding like it'll work for people. Yeah. Okay. All right. The in-person people are saying it'll work. Aiden says it'll work. All right. So let's plan on that Friday, 2 p.m. I'll email you that. Oh, I already have it in my calendar. I see. I anticipated this. See, look at me. Okay. So Friday, I'll write it here so I have a visual record. Friday, 2 p.m. Yeah, and I'll remind you all. So, and of course, the exam is the following week. Again, it's sort of awkward because we only meet once a week. Ideally, we'd have another class where we could do review stuff closer to the exam, but here we are. Yeah, and so that'll be next week. So why don't we look at the review sheet? Again, I just sent this to you. It's getting to be a big folder. We want this one. And there's kind of a lot of stuff. So, you can read the preamble. It's the same as last time. Open book, open note, in class Tuesday. As you probably noticed last time, I'm not super strict about the in-person thing, but I encourage you, if you are registered in person, to come in person. If you need special arrangements for the exam, let me know and I can help make it happen. And yeah, otherwise, here are all the terms. It's about the same amount as last time. I try to keep it to a one page. It might be a little bit more, honestly, even though the number of weeks, I think, is a little bit less, or is it exactly the same? No, I think it's exactly the same, actually. So it should be very similar to last time. This time, what are we focusing on? Just everything we've done so far. Greater vehicle, tantric Buddhism, Buddhist modernism, Buddhist magic. Tantric Buddhism covers a lot, right? So what we're doing today is tantric. We did the tantric meditation before. But yeah, that's basically the gist of it. It's a little bit of a grab bag, but that's kind of what Buddhism is, right? Remember the blind man and the elephant, there are all these different pieces. So this section of the course is a little less coherent, but at the same time, it covers more ground and we get kind of a fuller picture of what Buddhism is and how we can think about it. And just so you know what's coming, we're going to read Morinaga, Novice to Master, and then we'll be done. So this is kind of my gift to you is I'm cracking the whip a bit in week 12, but then we'll just read a book and write a paper about it for the last part of the course. So when all of your other classes will be ramping up, you'll have a little more mental space from this class. Make sure you get this book. Maybe is worth putting in the chat. Novice to Master. So I can highlight it. There's a little more than just reading this book, but not a ton more. We're mostly just going to read this and talk about it. So one last hump is this exam. Any questions off the bat? So to come back to Steven's question about the kind of half class we're doing last time, this is Rita Gross, Trungpa Rinpoche, and Natural Hierarchy. I think those are all coming from her, but everything else we'll cover today. So just like last time, we can do this at the review session, so you can go over this between now and Friday. But if you have any questions now, I'd be happy to hear them. Otherwise, we can just jump right in. Going once, going twice. Sold. All right, so let's just close all this, close all the tabs. Okay, so last time we talked about Nanak. This again was a pre-recorded lecture. I'm not going to redo the pre-recorded lecture, so if you didn't watch it, you can go back and watch that. But we can kind of go over it a little bit together because I have these little question mark things, these questions for you, and questions are not so interesting when there's no one around to answer them. So maybe we can just start. What is the story of Nong Nok? Did anybody watch the movie? Somebody must have watched the movie. Did anyone? Greg started it. Okay, very good. Greg, what do you think of it so far?
So far, it's just really slow.
It's really slow. Come on, it's not a very good review. We're trying we're trying to.
I mean, I
recruit
only
people to
watched like
watch it.
15 minutes and it seemed to be just like all setting up at the moment.
Okay, well, you watched 15 minutes of it. Well, yeah, it's true. This is from way back in the 90s. I think it's 1999. So it was a different age. It's before the era of the meme. People had a slightly different attention span back then. But yeah, it's mostly just setting it up in the first 15 minutes. That's fair. Okay, well, I'll leave you to it. But this is part of the exam. This is a good way to learn this story, is to watch the movie. I talked to some of you, and you said you don't like that kind of movie, right? Horror movies, that sort of thing. It is bloody, it is gory at different parts, and if you really don't like that sort of thing, then you should probably not watch this movie. You could read a very short summary of the story here. It's only 3 or 4 pages. And so if you want to know the story, that's probably the easiest way to do it. And if you want to do extra credit, just while it's on my mind, if you want to do extra credit and you don't want to watch Nong Nok, I could get a different movie for you too. So just let me know. But if you don't mind horror and that sort of thing, it's actually not so scary. It's not so horrible, I guess you could say. And it's mostly sad. That's my main impression of it. So if nobody's really seen the whole thing yet, I guess we can't reflect on the movie yet. Why don't we fill in this story then? What is the main story of Nong Nok? Did I tell you last time, Steven? Exactly. Yeah. So that's probably the setup that Greg saw, is going off fighting the war. Mom and baby, or mom to be and baby to be, are waiting at home, and it's a little bit of a spoiler, but for this analysis that we're doing today to make sense, I kind of have to spoil the story, so forgive me. Mom dies, right, in childbirth, and she becomes a ghost, and so I won't spoil any of the rest, but that's what this shrine is. Here's a shrine dedicated to the ghost of this woman. Now, it's the reading that we did for it is, the author's name is Wong, right? See, Wong is here. Wong is not totally explicit on, like, is this real life? Is this a legend? It's a legend, right? It's based on, she kind of inserts this toward the end, but I'll just make it extra explicit for you. It's based on a kind of more common story that's told all over Asia, where men and different spirits fall in love with each other. It's kind of a common trope. And this is just a particularly well-told version of the story that's then inserted into Thai history, right? So it theoretically takes place in the 19th century, but again, it's a legend. You don't have to take it too seriously. And yeah, again, I went over all of this sort of stuff in the pre-recorded lecture, so we don't have to do it too much. Some main themes is, we have these spirits. When people die a violent death, people think they are more likely to become a spirit to haunt the living. And again, this is bigger than just Thailand. This is I think a widespread belief. And maybe it's worth thinking about, why do you think that is? Why would the spirit of someone who suffers a violent death, and in this case, particularly women who die in childbirth, why do you think these spirits would then go on to haunt people? What about them says haunting to you, Stephen? Yeah.
Like, I think it was like, I think you said it was like, if they're not expecting them to die, then like they have like other stuff that they want to do about it, so like they might want to still come back and do that.
Yeah, perfect. And childbirth is a particularly powerful moment, right? Maybe some of you have more experience with this than I do. I actually have very little experience with it, but I can imagine many emotions are flying during childbirth, right? What kind of emotions are flying during childbirth? What do people feel like? Fear? What are people afraid of? Yeah. Yeah, this is real. And, again, unless you had like a really good health class or something, these are stories that often are kind of whispered right behind closed doors. because, you know, society wants to continue. People want you to have babies, but actually having babies is pretty scary, right? I totally agree with Sophie. Fear, I think, is a dominant emotion. And particularly for mom, right? It's a really hard time for mom. And so on the one hand, maybe it's this moment of excitement and joy once the baby is out, but there's a lot of fear and definitely exhaustion and all sorts of other difficulties. And that's, you know, assuming that things go well, right? And sometimes they don't. So lots of emotions happening. And so when somebody dies, there's, you know, it's sort of a folk idea, but there's a sense that those spirits continue. And Nanak is one version of this. I don't think I fully fleshed this out in the lecture. What do you think? Is Nanak a good wife / mother, or is she an evil seducer / monster? How do these categories apply to her? So as you're thinking about it, we've sort of seen this before, right? Like in the life story of the Buddha, there was the good Sujata who gave him the food, was very nurturing, and then there was the bad Mara's daughters who tried to tempt him, right? We saw sort of the good and the bad from very old Buddhist stories. How do these categories apply to Nanak? Is she good or is she bad from kind of a patriarchal point of view? Sophie?
Consumed by this deep love and serve her family, but like as a spirit, she's vengeful and she's trying to kill her, and like occupying both like a good and a bad space is like uncomfortable for like a lot of people to be women in.
Yeah.
Because of like a dichotomy kind of thing, and it's clearly interesting space.
Yeah, excellent. And I would argue that's what makes it a good story, right? If good and bad is really clear cut, then it's like boring, right? The goody goodies and the baddie baddies, and they're fighting each other. If there's nothing kind of mixing in between, no conflict, no confusion, then the story's not so good. But just if you guys can hear, Sophie said it really very nicely, that she kind of occupies both spaces, right? That both of these categories apply to her. You know, on the one hand, and again, this is speaking from the patriarchal point of view, she's the perfect wife, right? She's taking care of her husband while he's alive or while she's alive and while she's dead. She loves him so much, she won't even let him go when she's gone, right? She just wants to take care of him and be with him, right? That is like the ideal wife. That is like the perfect wife and perfect mother, because she's very caring for her child even beyond the grave too. And at the same time, she's also a monster, right? She's murdering people, threatening people. But, you know, as you, if you do the extra credit, you can think about it. Why is she doing that, right? And it takes you into sort of this uncomfortable place. On the one hand, you can be reviled by her behavior, but on the other hand, you can also totally understand it, right? At least if you give her a chance. And I think that's why she's so popular, right? So here are portraits and dresses that are being offered to her. You know, people treat her like a real person, and perhaps that's because they can see themselves in her, right? There's something very real, very alive about her. And then finally, the Buddhism part. This is what the extra credit will be, so we don't have to go through this too much, but maybe I can just remind you kind of what's at stake here. Again, Wong is a great writer. You know, it's sort of a short article, but she brings up some really interesting points. The only remedy, Buddhism is the only remedy for the untamed woman, the ultimate refuge for the jeopardized man. And again, we see that in the film. Here's a still image from it. You can see this is Nak standing on the roof of a monastery with the monks looking up at her. It's a very powerful scene. And there are questions, you know, this is kind of an open question. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. If you didn't watch the movie, it might be hard to answer this, but even just based on the article we read, did any Buddhist philosophical things jump out at you in this Nanak story? Things like the Four Noble Truths, things like desire, karma, craving, suffering, all this sort of stuff. Did anything jump out at you, Steven? Yeah. Yeah. And so it's worth thinking about. I think this is, what was the question I gave you? What does Nanak tell us about the role of Buddhism in lay society? I think that's the precise extra credit question I gave you. So this is one approach you could take, right? Is this a critique of love? Kind of. it kind of is, right? Or what? Maybe we can again leave it open and just say, what is this movie? What is the story saying about love? Right? Is it reducing it to a form of craving and saying that will only lead to suffering? At the same, I mean, yeah, in a way, but at the same time, kind of coming back to Sophie's point, it's also valorizing love and showing how powerful it is too, right? So it's not so cut and dry. You know, if this were a story told from the monk's perspective, it'd be very easy, right? He's just judging those silly people for being so in love all the time. That's such a bad idea. But it's really not. It's told from the lay people's perspective. And so it's a bit more complicated than that. So the Buddhist critique is definitely in there. There's some things about magic. This exorcist guy shows up. So he's sort of, he's not a major character. He's the one with the long hair who tries to mess with her grave. And we also see an adept and this village monk, or he's sort of like a scholar. They're all sort of interacting with each other. I think if we, since it's not the main subject for today, we won't need to watch this today. But you can go back and find the scene that where all these figures sort of come to a climax. So I'll leave it as a cliffhanger. But any last thoughts or questions about Nang Nang? Have I whetted your appetite? You guys gonna go watch this movie now? Say again. I think so. I'm pretty sure it's right after the exam. So what you can do is take the exam and see how it goes. And yeah, I wrote extra credit due the following week. So this is not like a hard deadline, but it's basically it's giving you motivation to do it, you know, while it's fresh, right? Because we're moving on from Nang Nang into other things after this. So yeah, the week after the exam is what I recommend. And again, watching this movie will help you prepare for the exam too. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Other questions, comments, ideas? Okay, so today's main topic is how to follow a spiritual friend. Kind of a change of pace, but we'll be able to tie it in at the same time. So here's the tie. We've talked a lot about scholars. In some ways, the very beginning of the class was all about monks and scholars and sort of Buddhist philosophy and that sort of thing. We moved on to these wizards and thought about Buddhist magic for a little while. We haven't really talked about what is a Buddhist adept, right? And so it's translating a Sanskrit word, siddha. We'll encounter that word again. I guess I could add it here too. Siddha. And the reason they're called siddha is because they have these attainments or accomplishments. In the reading, they call them accomplishments. I kind of like attainment. They're basically the same word. But siddhi, right? So these are clearly related words, right? A siddha is someone who has these attainments, these siddhi. And so that is what we will focus on today and think about how do they get them, right? How do you get these attainments? And in fact, there are many different ways to get them. We've actually already seen one. The Tara meditation promises certain powers. Remember, like all the different powers that Tara promised? Magic and control of the weather and alchemy and all that kind of stuff. Remember all that? So those would also be siddhis, right? Those would also be the same kind of attainments or accomplishments. But this system is a little bit later. What we're reading is translation from a 19th century book by Pacha Rinpoche. So, you know, only, 150 years ago or so. And as a result, it's a little more refined. It's a little more put together. It's a little more scholarly in a funny way, right? So these different categories kind of blend into each other. We get the scholars and we get the adepts. And so the adepts are writing books about how do you become an adept, and it becomes sort of scholastic. So these are not fully separate identities, but they have kind of different goals, right? Scholars, as we saw before, they read and write books. Wizards do their spells, and they might rely on some deities. But these adepts, what they're looking to do is develop these powers. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And more specifically, the role of the teacher in developing these powers. And that's really the main goal. Does that answer?
Yeah. Did you say that I have to sound like a mixture of like wizards, like they like have a sort of like mesh of the two, because they're like scholars, but they use like techniques that like wizards might use.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. It in let's say the period we're looking at, they basically become pretty mixed together. All three of these really, there's a lot of overlap. And so by separating them out, I'm kind of trying to highlight differences. So for example, if we watch the movie, the adept is a monk, the wizard is not a monk, right? And so that's one way we can kind of separate them out, as they have different sets of vows. But you're right to say that there is some overlap between the two, particularly in Tibet. That's one reason Tibetan Buddhism is so interesting, is they take a lot of this wizard stuff and they make it Buddhist, right? And so then by making it a part of this more adept world, yeah, there's quite a bit of overlap. So one way you can think about what is the difference, wizards use these spells, right? If you can like, again, almost like Harry Potter or something, look it up, find the spell, recite the spell, then that would be a wizard, right? If they're calling on deities, they all sort of do that. We're going to see another example of what it looks like to call on deities. I have another video to show you about that. Whereas these adepts, what do they normally do is they meditate, right? They're doing these meditation practices in order to develop their cities. It might not be instantaneous, right? Magic is sort of quicker. The power is in the spell that they're reciting rather than in them. And so these adepts, they meditate and they try to develop these powers inside of themselves. But it's true, the difference is a little bit superficial. I'll just say this right now, I'm not gonna grill you on this in the exam to differentiate between an adept and a wizard. But I do want to give you these tools to sort of differentiate important categories. Does that make sense? Good. And so again, how do you get these attainments? The way it's being presented here, and it's a way that I kind of like, is you have to rely on a teacher. So the teacher becomes very important. Again, a wizard doesn't necessarily need a teacher as long as they have their book. It'd be good if they had a teacher showing them how to recite the spells and so forth. And a scholar might need a teacher to learn how to read and write, but again, they're sort of relying on books. But here, we need a teacher for something a bit deeper than that, right? There's a sense that if we follow a spiritual friend, is the term used in the title of the chapter, how to follow a spiritual friend. See? We can examine what they're like, follow them and sort of see how they live their lives, and then finally emulate them. And this is something we'll see in the Zen tradition as well. So I encourage you to think critically about this chapter, right? I'm going to make a case for why it matters, just like I did with the magic, but I think this will rub some people the wrong way, and maybe for even good reasons, right? So just like we have with other things in this class, I want you to keep your critical thinking hats on as we go through this. So when we talk about a teacher, what are we talking about? It's a guru. Have you heard of gurus before? Of course you have, right? Because that's an English word now, but it's initially a Sanskrit word. And maybe you've heard this word too, is lama. So for example, the Dalai Lama. So the Tibetan word lama translates the Sanskrit word guru. Those are the same word. So the Dalai Lama is his title, of course. It's not his name. He's the 14th Dalai Lama. He was born in 1935. And he is one example of a spiritual teacher, a very famous spiritual teacher that a lot of people take very seriously. I think I've probably talked to you about this. Tibetan people in particular, or just Buddhist people in general, look at him as a very special person, right? They don't see him as just some regular old man. They see him as an embodiment of enlightenment, right? And what I will explain today, what we will explore today, is how that happens. That doesn't just happen out of nowhere, right? This is something that people have to kind of put effort into, is turning this person into a special person. I put Kylie Jenner here just to be a little cheeky, to go to show that not only is the Dalai Lama a special person, there are other special people in the world. And I'm kind of collapsing teachers and mentors and even influencers into sort of a similar category of people we look to use this word again, for influence, right? What does it mean to be an influencer? I know it has sort of capitalistic overtones to it, but there is something connected here, I think. Maybe I'm off in my connection. Maybe I'm pushing it a little too hard. But perhaps these are the spiritual friends of our modern age. let's see. We have an hour for this first part. Time's generally not a problem in this class, so we could do a little breakout now. Why don't we actually? Because I feel like I've got some lecture after this, and I don't want to make you guys too bored. So why don't we do a little kind of open conversation time? So just like we always do, if you haven't checked out the reading yet, start checking it out. You can open it up. You don't have to. I'm not going to like ask you to excavate it like I often do. Right? We're not going to go through section by section right now. Most of this first part is actually stories. The beginning is a little more theoretical, and it leads up to some of the stories. We get some theories about what are the good qualities of a teacher and that sort of thing. But I kind of want to just hear what you guys would say. So again, I use the language of influencer here. Maybe I'm going a little too far. But what are the qualities of a good teacher? Right? Why this might feel like a ridiculous question because you don't get to choose your teachers very often, right? You just show up in my class and Manhattan College says, this guy has a PhD, learn from him. He knows what he's talking about, right? And you actually don't get to check me out. You don't get to decide we will follow Bill because he is such a quality teacher. But I want you to think about this now, right? If you were able to choose a teacher, what would you look for in that teacher? Because to a certain degree, you do get to choose your teachers, right? You sign up for classes and so forth. I know a lot of the time it's random. So let's give this a try. So what, I guess, first of all, who are some teachers, mentors, influencers in your life? Maybe that's a good place to start. Who influences you? Who has taught you? Your parents are probably one of them. But beyond them, you could talk about them too, but beyond them, who has taught you things? Who has influenced you? And again, maybe you don't always think about this, but it doesn't have to be in the classroom. It could be in some activity. It could be in a coach. It could be some sort of other extracurricular activity if you're involved in those. So who has taught you things in your life, right? And in a way, what we're getting at is who are these spiritual friends in your life? And what are the qualities of these people, right? What makes somebody a good teacher? What makes somebody not such a good teacher? And then, of course, if you have time, what does Pacha Rinpoche say? So that he's the author of this book, again, translated from Tibetan. So it's a little tricky to get through, but at the same time, we'll work through it together. So yeah, once you identify a good teacher, a good influencer, how can we learn from them is another question. So why don't we start with who are the teachers, mentors, influencers in your life? And we can go from there. How's that sound? You guys ready? Talk about teachers. And of course, use this time. Okay, so that was a good conversation. Now, as you can probably tell, I'm going to steer us toward the reading now. The reading was a little heavy as I was going through it. I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of a lot. Maybe it's not a ton more than usual, but just because we're coming off of a weird schedule. For me, I usually break it up into pieces much more effectively, but to go through all, I think it was like 60 pages, did feel like kind of a lot. So hopefully you weren't too overwhelmed by it. Like I said before, this is a translation. Pacha Rinpoche, here's a picture of him. Here's another picture of him. This is, I think, an engraving. So he was a real person. He lived, not that long ago, in fact. He lived through the American Civil War, if you want to draw some parallels there. Obviously, he was not in America at the time. He was in Tibet. He's this very kind of eccentric figure where a lot of teachers are kind of propped up and respected. Maybe you can already tell, right? People like the Dalai Lama have a lot of power, a lot of social cachet, but he would famously kind of wander around the countryside and not pretend like he's some big powerful lama, some big powerful teacher. There's some story where he like showed up at some woman's house and acted as her servant, and she eventually figured out that he was this big teacher and was horrified that he was like cleaning her chamber pot or something like that. So he really kind of, what's the word? Practiced what he preached, right? We were talking about how Kylie Jenner is sort of fake. This guy you know, if the stories are true, and I have no reason to think that they're not, really was quite sincere, right? Quite sincere about what he taught. So it's one reason I really like this book. The book is called The Words of My Perfect Teacher. The Words of My Perfect Teacher. Kunzan Lame Shelong. And so then that was translated into English, and that is what we are reading here. And he boils it down to one thing, in fact. And it's maybe kind of parallel to this passion idea we were just talking about, but this is compassion, which of course are different things. We've seen this word before, bodhicitta. We didn't spend very much time on it, but it should be pretty familiar. I didn't want to overwhelm you with these terms when I was first introducing them, but it's basically what makes somebody a bodhisattva, right? We have bodhisattva is that enlightenment being. Bodhicitta is the same bodhi. It's an enlightenment thought or an enlightened heart even. It's the thought of awakening, the spirit of awakening. More specifically, is the compassionate motivation to achieve awakening for the sake of all sentient beings, right? So again, we've talked about this idea before, right? Remember, we talked about going up the ladder, right? Getting very close to Buddhahood, but not quite getting all the way into Buddhahood. And why not? Is because you want to stick around and help all beings. So this feeling of wanting to help all beings, Patrul Rinpoche is saying, if somebody has this, then they will be a good teacher. Is that a hint?
Yeah. Is that like part of like
It's a little bit different. Yeah. So let me think about this. Is this a part of Buddha nature? You can make the connection. So if I understand your question right, is this sort of a latent feeling that is already inside of all of us and all we have to do is awaken it? Yeah, kind of. I think there is a sense of that. But there's also a sense like you have to put in work to achieve this, right? It doesn't just come out of nowhere. You have to want it. You have to, again, that first step, what makes a regular person separate from a bodhisattva? Can you guys answer that question? How do you become a bodhisattva? There's a very specific, almost tangible thing you can do. How do you make that first step?
Make a vow.
Take a vow. Thank you. You take a vow, right? And so what is the vow? It is this. The Buddha did it, right? Before he came down in his final life. He looked down at all of the suffering beings and he made a vow. He said, I'm going to go down, I'm going to help those suffering beings. And so this is a theme that runs throughout all of Buddhism. And what Patrul Rinpoche is saying, if your teacher is a compassionate person and is living their life for the sake of other beings, now let's be clear, this is like a really intense form of compassion, right? So it's not some like, yeah, I like other people as long as it's convenient for me. It's more like, I will dedicate my life to helping everybody, right? Like this is a very serious sort of commitment. And a big part of this book, toward the end of what we read today, he gets to it, but most of where this comes from is in an earlier part of the book. He's basically saying anybody who has this dedication, who has taken this vow and takes this vow seriously, they would make a good teacher. But again, it is a very high standard to hold somebody to. He criticizes teachers. He says certain teachers are bad for various reasons. Did anybody look at this? This is sort of an interesting part. It's right at the beginning. If you were looking at the reading during your conversation, you could find some shade being thrown. So what is let's look at it together. 139 and 140, I think is all of them. Yeah. What are some of the bad qualities of a teacher being illustrated here? And you might have noticed there's sort of a prose explanation and then gets followed by verse. So I can even read you the verse as you're thinking about it. Like Brahmins, some defend their caste or in pools of fear for their fife's survival, bathe themselves in bogus study and reflection. Such guides are like a millstone made of wood. Some, although no different from all ordinary folk, are unthinkingly sustained by people's idiot faith, puffed up by profit, offerings, and honors. Such friends as these are like the well-bound frog. All right, maybe we can just start with those. The millstone made of wood might not make sense to anybody. What is a millstone usually made out of? Stone, right? Good, yeah. Why is a millstone made out of stone? What is a millstone? Well, what do you do at a mill? And I have a vague sense of what I'm talking about here, but I'm not an expert at these sorts of things. So what do you make at a mill? Right. You put in grain, and what comes out? Is that a hint? No. Trying to think. It's how you make flour for grinding grain. Yeah, so you grind grain and you get flour. Now, again, this is an agricultural metaphor that maybe is just not useful for us because we're not really agricultural people. But let's just think, why is it important for this to be made out of stone? If we're grinding grain and making flour.
Probably because like you're like if you're grinding something, you want it to be like maybe like more durable or a certain like hardness so that it can actually like crush the grain or something like that.
Exactly.
I can kind of understand this.
Yeah. You can understand the thing now. So let's look at grain, right? So this is what grain looks like, and this is what flour looks like. So after you grind grain, it gets pulverized, right? It becomes a lot more fine. And once you turn it into this fine powder, then you can manipulate it into a dough and bake it into a bread or make it into a noodle or whatever you want to do with it, right? So what's the problem with a millstone made out of wood? So I'll just read this last part. As for training disciples, this is at the top of 140, they are about as well suited to fulfilling their proper function as a millstone made out of wood. What's wrong with a millstone made out of wood?
It's not going to pulverize the grain as well. So like it's sort of like the teacher isn't going to like be able to like provide enough information or like be a good enough teacher to pretty much bake the bread, which is like enlightenment or like the continuation of like good teaching.
Everything was perfect except the bake the bread part, because the millstone's not baking the bread, right?
It's kind of like the final result of the bread.
Yeah, exactly. So a teacher that is only concerned about, getting their paycheck, right, is only concerned about their status. Everybody call me Dr. Bill, right? Everybody respect me and do what I tell you to do and turn all these things in on time and all that sort of stuff. You guys ever met professors like this before? Yeah, absolutely. They're all over the place, right? So he's saying a teacher who only cares about these sort of formalities, they're not going to be able to teach, right? Just like a millstone is supposed to grind grain into flour. If you make it out of wood, it won't be able to do it, right? And this kind of teacher, they won't be able to teach, they won't be able to educate, and their students won't be able to learn, right? So just like Stephen was saying, they won't be able to perform their function. That one, again, it's a little bit of a stretch because we're not agriculturalists. It's a little harder for us to reach it. The frog one, I think, is easier to understand. What's up with the frog? Teachers like the frog that lived in the well. What's wrong with the frog living in the well?
People just kind of hype them up and they kind of believe that they're like these really good teachers, but they don't really have the kind of knowledge that they require. And they talk about like these two frogs, and one's like hiding in the ocean, and one's frog still able to swim around.
Yeah.
They're like half the size of this thing.
Uh-huh.
And so like once he sees it, he like fakes.
Yeah.
I can't imagine something so bad.
He fainted, his head split apart, and he died. What a story. Yeah. So some of these stories are bizarre, but again, it's coming from this Tibetan book. So there it is. Again, this might feel a little hard to reach because we all have the internet now, right? We all know how big the ocean is, at least to a certain degree. And so maybe we can try to abstract it out. What sort of quality is being criticized here? And again, we're criticizing bad teachers. So what is a quality of a bad teacher that's coming out here? This frog who lived in the well. Stephen?
There's not like no like conviction or like sort of hoping growth, I guess. Or like trying to like branch out and understand, like actually understand what they're doing.
I like that. Yeah, they're not open to growth. And why are they not open to growth? Is because they think, all right, I know my little well, and this is all that I need to know, right? All your big ocean stuff, you can have it. I don't care. I got my well. And the ocean's probably what, like the half the size of my well or something like that? So they just take their very limited knowledge, right? This very limited thing that they know about, and basically don't respect what everybody else knows, right? And again, you can still find people like this. We live in an age that is so humbling in terms of information. It's kind of unbelievable. I think we all do have a little sense like there are things we don't know. But again, you can find the arrogant frog who lives in the well. The other ones are a little more straightforward. Crazy people, blind people, right? You don't want blind leading the blind. So maybe that's enough of that. So these are, qualities of a bad teacher. And it's reminding us that we should examine the teacher, right? Again, if we go back to the top, where did I give you this? Yeah. So how do you follow a spiritual friend? You got to examine them, right? You got to see, is this a worthwhile person to follow? Because if the answer is no, you don't want to waste your time. In fact, you're not just wasting your time. What did I just show you? Not examining the teacher is like drinking poison, right? This is dangerous. And especially if you take this tradition seriously, right? Because there is a very deep relationship between the student and the teacher. And if you get involved with a bad teacher, it really could endanger you in a very meaningful way. And I think that's true for us now. So again, I think this is good advice, right? Examine the teacher. We talked about how you can't choose your relatives, and that's true. You can examine them too, but they're still going to be your relatives. But if you examine a teacher and you find them to be creepy or a problem for whatever reason, then you don't have to be their student anymore, right? So this is a very important first step here. And then on the flip side, not to examine the disciple is like leaping from a precipice. Do I get to examine you guys before I take you on as my disciples? I do not. I do not. There's no ratemystudent.com. There really should be. Man, there really should be. No, I think there is sort of a private ratemystudent.com at Manhattan College, actually. I don't ever use it, but I'm sure somebody somewhere does. But yeah, to not examine the disciples like leaping from a precipice. Why do you think it says that? What is it warning me? What could happen to me if I take on a bad student? Disaster. I could get a bad review on ratemyprofessor.com. Oh no, other bad things could happen. And again, we kind of don't get to do that here, right? For better or for worse, right? In the old days, I would not have health insurance and I would not be taken care of by an institution. And so the institution takes care of all these things for us. Now, that being said, Manhattan College does vet all of you guys, doesn't it? It's just been sort of outsourced, right? There's a whole department dedicated to reading your applications and determining what our standards are and all that sort of thing. So we do examine you guys, just not quite in the way that's meant here, not personally. And then finally, yeah, this sort of shows us where we're going. When you examine a teacher and you really do find them worthy and qualified, it doesn't say to just sort of stop there and say, oh yeah, you're pretty cool. It says to see them as a Buddha, right? To basically see the teacher as a Buddha appearing in human form for human beings' sake. And I told you that this might rub some of you the wrong way. This is probably the part that will start to rub you the wrong way. There's something very hierarchical happening here, right? In America, we tend to do well criticizing figures of authority, right? And saying that person's a bad teacher, that person's a bad president, or that person can't tell me what to do or whatever. Actually, Ciara made a really good comment about how she learns a lot from her friends, and it made me think, the term here is spiritual friend, right? Kalyana Mitra, it really means friend in Sanskrit. And so there is a sense of friendship here, and yet there is also a very strong sense of hierarchy. So I think this is one major difference, is that we tend to be somewhat suspicious of hierarchy in America. It's what we're founded on, right? We're founded on revolution, getting rid of the bad hierarchies of the old world. But here, it is very much bound up in hierarchy, for better or for worse. Sometimes there are major problems that come from this hierarchy, which we will also talk about. Actually, that's exactly what Rita Gross's article is about. So it'll be mostly next week. But we'll see kind of how it's supposed to work today. And I'm going to present it and try to make a case for it, because I think something amazing can happen if it works well, but it does not always work well. Okay, good. So that's sort of the prelude, right? Examining. And then the way we're supposed to follow teachers is mostly told through stories. We're not quite at break time yet. Let's see, it's 8. When do we usually take break time? Is it break time? let's do at least one story before we take a break. Let's aim to. I feel like starting at 8:30 usually works because then we just have a solid hour. So let's try to aim for that. So let's go for like another 10 minutes. Maybe we can even get through both of these stories. That was my initial plan. So there are actually three stories. This one is a bit of a mouthful. Sada Prarodita. It means the ever weeping one, which I think is a beautiful name. Why is he ever weeping? It's actually not totally clear. I guess because he wants the teachings. But that is a pretty intense story. It starts on page 153. And then the rest of this first section is really all stories straight away. So if you like stories, you can kind of skip on down to 153 and you get Sada Prarodita, you get Naropa, and you get Milarepa. And we're going to think about them for at least the rest of the next 10 minutes. So what is Sada Prarodita's story about? This one's more of like almost a myth. It's ancient India, all sorts of crazy things happen, gods show up, great offerings are made. So again, it starts on 153. At the bottom we have a bodhisattva, Sada Prarodita, and he became the disciple of this Buddha, and he's really excited about it. He's looking for prajna paramita. So I'm saying all these words that you probably don't understand, but prajna paramita you probably can know. So this is the perfection of wisdom. Remember we talked about the 6 perfections a long time ago? We talked about Madhyamaka, middle way philosophy. Remember middle way philosophy, right? I think I drew the thing on the board here where we're going back and forth, taking things apart and putting them back together again. Remember that? So that's what he wants to learn, is how to do that. And, I gave you my very basic overview of what this philosophy is, but there are depths to it that I did not cover in our very sort of limited fashion that we have in this class. And that is what Sada Prarodita wants. He wants to know how things really exist, right? He wants to know kind of the secret to reality. And so he goes for it. And, when I read the story, it makes me think, I want that too, right? He wants it so bad. He wants it so bad. He goes crazy over it. And I could ask you guys to tell the story, but I have a feeling, what? Does anybody want to tell the story? You guys probably don't know it. Anybody in the chat know it? Probably not. So I'll just tell it to you. So, but follow along. It's on, again, 153 to 157. We've got this figure, and he thinks, all right, I need to go find transcendent wisdom. And this is sort of a summarized version, but he goes all over the place. He asks all these teachers, and then eventually they're like, hey, here's this guy. He can give it to you. And so he has a vision. He has a vision of this teacher doing whatever he likes, and he thinks, all right, I want to give a nice gift to this teacher so I can get the teachings from him. And so he's full of joy, faith, and devotion. That's at the bottom 154, and then top of 155. And he thinks, okay, what can I do? He says, I'm poor. I have nothing with which to honor him. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sell my flesh. I'm going to sell the flesh of my body, and with the money I receive for it, I will honor the Bodhisattva Dharmodgata. Sounds like a reasonable plan. Why doesn't he think I'm going to sell, I don't know, something else? I'm going to go like find some grain out in the, go begging or something and then just offer whatever I get from begging. Why does he not think that? I don't know. But he thinks I'm going to sell my flesh. And so a little further down, he gets a sharp knife and he goes for it. He cuts out some of his flesh. I should rewind. The reason he does that is because Indra, the king of the gods, comes down. He's like, hey, I heard you wanted to sell some flesh. I'll buy your flesh. And he sort of tests him. And he's like, all right, I'm going to go for it. He sells his flesh. So he's really ready to go with this whole selling his flesh thing. But then, somebody, a daughter of a merchant hears what he's going for here. And she's like, hey, I'll help you go find these teachings. And then Indra's like, yeah, I was just playing. I didn't really want your flesh. And there's sort of an interesting moment where rather than letting Indra sort of make him whole again on 156, he says, I shall invoke the blessings of the truth, by the blessings of the Buddha's prediction that I will never return into samsara, which of course is cyclic existence. by the truth of my supreme and unshakable determination, and by the truth of my words, may my body resume its former state. So again, it's taking a little bit of a shot at the Hindu gods, right? We've seen that before, where the gods are like, they're kind of good, but they're not like the best. They're sort of just in the background. Here we see it again, where the gods are almost causing a little bit of mischief, and they're not setting things straight, even though he theoretically could. Sadapravadita says, by the truth of his determination, of his supreme and unshakable determination, by the truth of my words, may my body resume its former state. So that is the blessing that lets him kind of become whole again. He eventually does find the teacher. He's really excited. There's another bizarre scene where they're ready to sprinkle the ground with their blood to sort of keep the dust down. But it's all super hyperbolic. But the takeaway is like, this guy's ready to run straight through a brick wall to get these teachings, right? And so, with my very brief retelling, I don't know if you get any sort of special feeling, but it makes me want to run through a brick wall, right? To me, that's the real takeaway here is by sharing in this somewhat bizarre story, you see someone who's willing to give up his own flesh in order to receive these teachings. Whereas all you guys have to do is just kind of pay attention, right? I know it's a little bit late, but right? It sort of, it almost lights a little bit of that passion we were talking about, right? This figure, Sadapravadita, is so passionate about these teachings, it almost can infect us via over time, over space, over culture, into the present day, right? And it doesn't even tell us what he learns. I think that's the real bummer. If they gave us a little taste of the perfection of wisdom, that would be nice. But in any case, the motivation stays the same, right? Here's a really excited, fired up guy who is ready to learn some Buddhism. So that's Sadapravadita. Questions about this? How does this sound? Perfection of wisdom. So he really wants to just get on this path to enlightenment. Now, let's look at one more and then we'll take a break. This one is also pretty hyperbolic. It's a little closer in time. It's a little less mythological and a little more historical. Naropa was probably a real guy. He probably really did exist. He was a high caste Indian scholar, right? We've talked about scholars before. His teacher was this guy Tilopa, who was a low caste Indian beggar, an adept, right? So he was an adept, but he was low caste. And so we begin to see sort of differences between these figures that I've been trying to highlight for you. As you can see, here's a picture of Naropa. He looks more like an adept here. He's wearing like, animal skins, and this is like a meditation band that sort of lets you keep the meditation posture for a really extended amount of time, even after you get tired. That was also mentioned in the reading at one point. This is Vajravarahi, Vajra Yogini. She actually shows up in the visualization section too. So that's what she looks like. She's all red. Very quickly, there's a similar sort of story that happens here, where again, a disciple is really fired up to learn from a teacher. Naropa encounters his teacher eating a bunch of fish, which is sort of a weird thing to do. He's this weird beggar guy who's eating a bunch of fish, and his initial thought is the actions of siddhas, right, these adepts, the actions of adepts are incomprehensible. Let's see, can I find that? Actually, I think that was an anecdote earlier on when it's talking about developing the proper way of looking at your teacher. And so Tilopa really kind of tortures the guy. It's a little bit uncomfortable to read through it, right? At least with Sadapravadita, he's doing it to himself. He's cutting off his own flesh. He's offering his own blood. Here, Tilopa is kind of asking these cruel questions. They climb up to the top of a building, and he says, is there anyone who can leap from the top of this building to obey his master? And so what do you think Naropa does? He jumps off, and his body is all crushed and broken, and he can't move. At the top of 158, he says, it's not just the pain, groaned Naropa. I'm not much more than a corpse. But Tilopa blessed him. His body was completely healed. And then they went off and they did something else. And so he keeps torturing him. This second part, he like crams horrible splinters under his nails, like it's some sort of torture. It really quite literally is torture. And then Naropa steals some food for his teacher, and he gets his ass beat as a result of that. He thinks, oh, my teacher loved this soup so much, I'm going to steal some more for him. And then he gets caught and he gets beaten. And then finally, the sort of climactic moment on 159 is Tilopa, where is it? They're like preparing a fire. Naropa comes back. Tilopa jumps up from the fire at the top of 159. He grabbed Naropa's head with his left hand. He says, "Show me your forehead." With his right hand, he took off a sandal and hit his disciple on the forehead with it. Naropa lost consciousness. When he came to, all the qualities of his teacher's wisdom, mind had arisen within him. Teacher and disciple had become one in realization. So if we think about what is the moral of this story, kind of disturbing, isn't it? What would you guys say is the moral of all of these stories? Or at least the Naropa Tilopa story. What are the moral of these stories? Is there a moral, Stephen?
I don't know, because I would think that what they're trying to say is that like their teacher is like not like you should respect the teacher no matter what. If they're like knowledgeable, then you have to respect that.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they're also trying to like sort of make fun of it sometimes. Some of these stories kind of do that. So like the story with Nanda, remember what it was? It was like about love.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good but also a bad thing.
Yeah. I see. So maybe there's a little satire in here or something like that.
I don't know if there is satire, but from what it seems like, it's more to respect your teacher.
Yeah. Yeah. I think more than satire, I would say it's maybe just hyperbole, right? It's just so exaggerated. It's so extreme, right? To the point where if, I'm a sincere young disciple and I hear this story and I think, oh my goodness, Naropa did all of that for Tilopa? Well, surely I can like mop my teacher's floor, or do some small inconvenience for my teacher, right? It wouldn't be the same as what Naropa is doing here, but at least it'd be something, right? It'd be some sort of offering, right? Some sort of inconvenience that I will put myself through for the sake of my teacher. And again, I mean, this is abuse, right? Let's be clear about what this is. This is inflicting horrible physical harm upon a student. And then the student basically saying, "Thank you, sir, may I have another," right? So the implications of this are quite dark in a way. And so I encourage you to see that, right? But I also encourage you to see what might be gained from this as well. And I think they both must be seen at the same time. For our final moment, and we can begin with this after the intermission, there's this idea of pure perception, where basically the student must see, again, after you have examined the teacher and decided that they are your teacher, they've sort of proven themselves, the student must commit themselves to the teacher in a very deep way and commit to this idea of seeing them purely, right? Where if you ever see a fault in your teacher, that is on you, right? It is on you for seeing the fault, because the teacher is perfect. And so it is up to you to see them purely, right? So what does it say? If your teacher appears angry, conclude that he has seen a fault in you, ripe for correction with his rebukes. Confess, and vow never to repeat it. Thus the wise will not fall under the power of Mara. So again, there's a slippery slope that's being presented here, where it really does open the door for students to be abused and, again, not say anything about it, not being able to do anything about it. Absolutely true, and it absolutely happens, right? I could have brought up a whole list of teachers who have abused students under this sort of language of pure perception. At the same time, I think there is something to be, something valuable to be found here, right? And so I encourage you to kind of keep both perceptions open to the extent that you can, at least. You don't have to have a pure perception, but at least try to see with multiple perspectives. So, okay, we are over the time that I promised. We can start at 8:35, right? Because I guess we end at 9:35 anyway. So why don't we say that? Before we take a break, any questions or anything? How are we all doing? I know that was a lot of talking and storytelling before the break, but yeah, let's reconvene at 8:35. Let's take a 17-minute break this time. Okay. I think I will hit the lights. Okay.
So wait, so which one was the teacher, which one was the student?
For what?
So, like, the story you're telling.
Let me get the lights here. Okay, so those last stories we went over are a little, again, we use the word, we talk satirical, maybe hyperbolic. They're a little extreme, right? It's like, why is this guy cutting his flesh off, right? Does he really need to do that? Even though it is just a story, we still kind of hold stories up to a certain standard of logic. You guys agree with me, right? In order to suspend our disbelief. And frankly, these are old stories, so maybe we should judge them based on that fact that they are old stories. There are many old stories where figures cut off body parts and offer them to people. Like a classic one in Chinese Buddhism is like the pious child making an offering to their parent, or it doesn't have to be a parent. It could be even to a teacher, right? Where they might even feed their own flesh to somebody who's hungry, right? So it's a common theme really throughout all of Asia, where people are making offerings of their flesh to each other. But again, it feels a little outlandish, right? It feels a little extreme. And Stephen was asking about these details. We can go over them again. So Naropa, he's the student. Tilopa, he's the teacher. And their story is pretty outlandish too, pretty extreme, right? So like, why does Tilopa have to torture Naropa so much? Naropa didn't do anything wrong, right? He seems like a pretty nice guy. There's no logic within the story itself to kind of justify this really extreme behavior. But I'm about to show you one more story about Milarepa. And again, I apologize for all the stories, but that's kind of how it was arranged in the reading. This last story actually has quite a bit of logic to it, I would argue. It's still pretty extreme, still a little hyperbolic, but I think there's more logic to it. So maybe that's all I will say, and we can kind of work our way through it. There's a movie about Milarepa, but it only shows the very beginning of his life. So again, if you want to follow along, 160 is at the very top there. Milarepa, he's a very famous Tibetan saint. He's maybe, I'm going to say top 5 Tibetan saints. He's like really very, very famous. So when Patrul Rinpoche is writing about Milarepa to his audience, he basically everybody already knows him, right? And so he's giving some of the details. The part I'm about to show you shows up in this first paragraph. So maybe we can even just look at it together. So Milarepa, he's born into a family. His name is Tubhaga when he's first born, which means a joy to hear. It's kind of a beautiful name. But his father dies, and his uncle takes all their wealth and possessions. Don't you hate it when you got an evil uncle taking all of your wealth? So that's what's going on here. And so the 2 children, so that's Milarepa, his sister, and his mother, they're all left with no food or money, and they have to go through many hardships. Milarepa learns the arts of casting spells and making hailstorms from the magicians Yungdun Trogel of Tsang and Harje Nupchung, and brought about the death of his uncle's son and daughter-in-law with 33 other people by making the house collapse. So this is the part we are going to focus on here. As you can tell, it's about magic. It's about wizards and many other themes we've talked about. This is the whole film. So if you want to watch it, you can. It only shows a small part of Milarepa's life, unfortunately, so you won't get the full story from this. But it's pretty well done. As far as Tibetan movies go, at least it's one of the better produced ones. Let me look. What was the timestamp? 54. So as you watch this, I just kind of want to give you a sense of, again, what is this whole Tibetan magic, Buddhist magic thing all about? How do I do this? Optimize. And then I put it back to this, and then we hit play. So this is Milarepa here with his companion. And they're looking for magic teaching. And maybe I'll just talk over this. So they meet this old guy. He kind of gives them instructions on how to build this little cave. So they start building the cave, and this is where they're going to do the magic. Little part of the story of the life of Milarepa. So unfortunately, the well-produced version of this movie is just one little piece of the story. There are other less well-produced versions of this story that we actually, if there's time, I have a couple clips from as well, but they're not as good. Okay, maybe I can throw this at you guys, because again, this is part of what we've been talking about for the last few weeks. What would you say is kind of the Buddhist critique of magic there? What is magic missing that Buddhism can give, just based on that little exchange with the monk and everything we saw so far? We talked about, well, a lot of you talked about in your assignments that magic is sort of irrational, not realistic, but that's not what they're saying here, right? Magic is very real, at least in this story, and yet it is still being criticized, right? What is it being criticized for? Yeah. Well, it solved one problem. It killed his enemies, right? If that was what he really wanted, then maybe he got some of that. But it didn't kill all of his enemies, right? In fact, he said something to that effect, that enemies keep coming, right? Even though he took care of some enemies, there's still other enemies who are mad. It's almost like an eye for an eye sort of thing, right? Which, again, really dominates, if not our world, then let's say the traditional world, where people were constantly bickering over, you killed my brother, so I'm going to kill you. And then that person's brother is going to kill me. And then my brother's going to kill that person, right? And it just kind of keeps going on, back and forth like this. What was the monk's response to all these enemies? I thought it was another nice line that the monk said. Did anybody catch it? Yeah, right. The enemies are in your mind. And it's not totally clear what he means by that, right? I have my thoughts, but it's sort of open. Yeah, so there's a bit of an inward turn, we could say. With magic, you're trying to sort of affect the world out there, right? Have some sort of effect on the way that things happen out in the world. But at least what this monk was saying is, think about your mind, think about your emotions, stop doing bad things, start doing good things, try to control your mind. If your mind is out of control, then you will see enemies all over the place, right? And you'll get into all kinds of fights. And even if you're a very powerful wizard, you'll still have a bunch of enemies. But if you are an accomplished Buddhist, then you'll be able to control your mind. And so that was one of his first, really, at least in this movie, his first Buddhist teaching, right? Was this little exchange with this monk. Now, like I said, the story we read for today, that gets summarized in a little, like half a paragraph, right? So there's a lot of detail to the story that gets left out, but that's what you have to do when you're summarizing things. But the story goes on from there. He eventually does meet his Buddhist teacher, this guy named Marpa, and he feels really dedicated to him from the beginning. Like it's a very famous scene where Milarepa just hears the name of his teacher, Marpa, and I should say too, Marpa is the student of Naropa. So it ties in with that last story. Marpa is a translator who went over to India, studied Sanskrit, translated scriptures into Tibetan, and then brought those teachings back to Tibet. So this is a story of bringing Buddhism to Tibet. It's a story that, again, is even more historical than the Naropa story, although this is still somewhat legendary too, as you can tell from all the magic and that kind of stuff. Milarepa was a real historical figure from around 1,000 years ago. And so he's very famous for when he hears his teacher's names, the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He gets so inspired. He's so excited to hear about this teacher. And so he goes in, he says he's the great sinner from the West. And so this is a sinner to saint narrative as well, right? So there's all this bad karma in the background. He's doing all this bad magic. He's committing all of these sins, and that's kind of weighing on him. But he finally finds his teacher, and he says, "Teacher, I'll do whatever you want me to do. Please teach me the Dharma, right? Teach me the Buddhist teachings, and I want to achieve Buddhahood in this lifetime." So he basically kind of lies down at his teacher's feet, prostrates to him, and says, "Please, just teach me the Dharma." And Marpa is also kind of a jerk to Milarepa, right? It's another one of these stories where the teacher is somewhat abusive. This one, it makes a little more sense than in the other ones. I could kind of dance around this a bit more. I think maybe we watched enough video clips. You don't actually get too much out of this. It's basically just Milarepa building these towers. I guess you get to see the Tibetan landscape. Maybe that's worth seeing. You guys want to see Tibetan landscape? Okay, you guys want to see. All right. So Marpa comes out and he tells Milarepa to build these castles for him, these towers for him. There are no subtitles on this one, but again, if we're just looking for kind of visuals, then that's okay. Maybe we don't have to go full cinematic. I can kind of talk over this one. So here's Marpa. Here's Milarepa kind of sitting at his feet and doing whatever his teacher tells him to do. Marpa's strict. Marpa's kind of, we could say he's stern, to put it sort of nicely. Here's Tibetan writing that says the Namtar, the complete liberation of Milarepa, of Jetsun Milarepa. And so this is, again, not as high production. It's actually filmed in Tibet, though. The other one, I think, was filmed in northern India. So this is what Tibet looks like. And as you can see, he has no equipment other than his own back. He's carrying all these heavy stones up and down mountain passes, using them to construct a tower. He's a pretty skilled builder, though. Look at him go. And I think they switch episodes. Eventually, Marpa shows up, and he's like, "Hey, this is pretty good. Why don't you build me a different one, though? I told you the wrong thing." And then Milarepa is like, "Okay, I'll take it down and build it up again." And this happens a few times. Marpa comes back, and he's kind of drunk. The one where he's drunk is sort of funny. Where is that one? I think it's this one. And again, it's sort of just cruel, though. He's just like, "I didn't tell you to build a square one. I wanted a circle one."
Raison. Aum Tachin. 산드등 큰와잉 죽문드. 교른그 사삼을등 도말들줄. 대지 마크 싱거를 찐달리 가르직스.
라말라 카르영 영식 든자시나 더그두글라 라미 시르진자 발레 만두페 다리 투삼 나노 동아리지
가흥은 가르티스 그가 챙급선들. 달은 챙급소하행매.
So anyways, he tells him to keep building these towers, and that's basically what this 50 minutes of TV is. It's just Milarepa setting up and taking down towers. So as you can see, that's why this movie is not quite as popular as the other one. It has a slightly different kind of tone to it. But there is, again, I at least am trying to defend this story as making a little more sense, and maybe I can pose this as a question for you guys. Why does this building up of towers and taking them down make more sense in this story? This almost punishment of the disciple. Why does it make more sense in this story than in the other ones? Does this make sense to you? Why do you think his teacher is being so cruel to him here? Steven? Oh, I like that. I wasn't even going to get that poetic, but that's great. Yeah, so if you couldn't hear him, Steven said it's almost like he's building up and deconstructing himself in the process, right? It's almost like building these towers is a symbol for him going through the process of deconstructing himself. And of course, I'm sure Stephen was thinking this, why would he need to do that? It's because he did all this bad karma, right? He did all these negative actions. He even comes out and says it, with all my evil karma. Let's see, I have a ... which means I skipped something. Yeah, it says he was reading Satapravodita, so all those other stories kind of tie into this story, and that is why they're all told together. It's because this is kind of the culmination of those other stories, right? For a Tibetan audience in particular, this is when it becomes real, right? This is when they're actually talking about something more directly relevant to the audience. Okay, so yeah, here it is. Milarepa is thinking to himself, with all my evil karma, not only do I myself suffer because of my heavy faults and dense obscurations, but now I'm bringing difficulties to these other people. Since I'm just piling up more and more harmful actions without receiving any teaching, it would be best if I did away with myself. So he gets to the point of becoming suicidal, right? So it's not like Sada, Prarodita, or any of these other disciples who are so fired up and so ready that they're like chopping off body parts in order to learn the teachings, right? Here's somebody who's a bit more tender. I mean, he's definitely determined, right? He has incredible perseverance to be able to build all these towers, but at the same time, he's kind of at the end of his rope here, right? He's at his wit's end, let's say. And of course, that's when Marpa comes in and he's like, hey, I'll give you the teachings. I was just giving you a hard time to work through all of your negative karma and all that sort of thing. And of course, then Milarepa goes on to achieve enlightenment, but we only get a little taste of that in this final paragraph on 165. So it's a little more, we could say, realistic, but it builds on this longer lineage of, we could say, myths and legends about developing this incredible devotion and perseverance in trying to learn the Buddhist teachings. So that's the story of Milarepa. Do you guys have any questions about this? Again, these are just a little bits and pieces. There's a full translation of the life of Milarepa in Penguin Classics form. If I ever taught a class on Tibetan religions, we'd probably read the whole thing, but this is just a little bit of a taste. And so again, what do we get from these stories? There are many different ways to put it. I just put what I thought were kind of beautiful, poetic lines, but we wander like a blind man alone in an empty plain, right? We saw those empty plains, right? Those are some pretty big empty plains out in Tibet. Our spiritual friends, the supreme teachers, think of us with their boundless compassion, and according to the needs of each of us appear in human form. And so again, Milarepa, without Marpa, or at least that's what's being presented here, would have been in a lot of trouble, right? He would not have been able to work through these sins, even try to work with other teachers, and it didn't work, right? He learned some other teachings, but because he was so sinful, he was unable to sort of see through and achieve any sort of enlightenment, at least not in this life. And so, again, by going through these hardships and by having this kind of tough love from Marpa, he was able to achieve his goals, or at least that's what we're being told here. And again, the takeaway is to treat the teacher like a real Buddha. That's what we're being told to do. And so this last part of class today is thinking about how to really do that. It's a practice called Guru Yoga. But before we switch over, any last thoughts or questions about these stories? So one way you can think about what we've read for today is we've done a lot of narrative. And narratives really do, we say, inform and inspire, right? Again, we talked about who are your mentors and who are your teachers. None of you probably said it like Superman or anything like that, right? But at the same time, if you watch a movie with a good role model in it, you might be inspired to think, okay, what would Superman do in this situation, right? Or what would some other figure do in this situation? And so these are narratives, but there are also other ways to transform how you act and look at the world. And I would argue that is ritual, right? And this is something we've talked about before. So maybe you remember deity yoga. You guys remember deity yoga? We did deity yoga with Tara. And so you could kind of imagine all these enlightened qualities of Tara and then try to sort of take them on to yourself. There's a very similar kind of practice done for the guru, right? Done for the lama, done for the teacher. So again, as we think about, who are our mentors in this world and how do they influence us, usually it's kind of passive, right? It's maybe they're being active because they teach us stuff, but we're sort of passive and learning from them. What this is trying to show is here's a very active way to take on an influence from somebody. And this is probably going to be a little unfamiliar, but it's kind of interesting. So it takes that more imaginative deity yoga practice where you're using some deity and trying to take on their qualities. Here, it's doing it with a person, right? But it's a person who has kind of been deified in a way. So it's almost mixing deity with person together. Okay, so yeah, this line about considering the teacher to be a real Buddha, it just keeps getting said over and over and over again. And the goal of the practice is to merge, it says, in this way, your mind will merge completely with his, right? So it's almost like this, where you imagine this person to be perfect, right? And again, this is Professor Bill talking now. It doesn't matter if they really are, right? From the outside, in that story, Marpa was kind of a jerk. He's getting drunk. He's being abusive. He was making his student do all these horrible things. He's kind of a jerk. But Milarepa saw him as a perfect Buddha, right? And so by doing this practice, seeing him as a Buddha, and then doing this Guru Yoga practice with him as a Buddha in mind, the result remains the same. So in a way, this has less to do with the qualities of the teacher and more to do with the student, him or herself. So again, what are we trying to do here is to merge our mind with that of the teacher. Again, it's pretty scholastic, right? There's a list, and within these lists, like the offerings, there are 7 things within the offerings. And so we don't have to really go through the whole structure of it. I mean, we could do that if that's what you're interested in, but I don't think you will be. We can more think kind of what is the logic, what is the logic operating behind this larger practice. And just like the deity yoga, it begins with visualization, where you imagine some sort of being, some sort of figure in front of you. We talked about merging the identity of the teacher with something like a deity, and that's exactly what we see happening here. So you, whoever you are, you the practitioner, which in 19th century Tibet would mostly be men, you're being told to visualize yourself as a woman, to be a woman. First, let me open it up to 313. So this is the second part of the reading now. We jumped between 2 different sections. First, it's this figure called Yeshe Tsogyal. You don't have to worry about who she is, but she is a Tibetan woman. And she was the wife of this guy, Padmasambhava. We've actually met him before. You might not remember. We looked at this image of him before, I think. So same guy. He's sort of this Buddhist wizard type figure who also becomes sort of like a Buddhist adept. He's kind of both. Here are his two wives. One is Tibetan, one is Indian. I couldn't tell you who is who. They look almost exactly the same to me. Maybe some art historian somewhere could tell you the difference. But we're supposed to be one of these wives, but then we are also to think of ourselves as Vajrayogini, which is this figure, which is also a female deity. Slightly different. This one's black. It says the one we're supposed to think of is red, with one face, two arms, three legs. No, sorry, three eyes. I was going to say three legs. I've never seen that one before. So yeah, three eyes, and I think this is a bit of a stretch, but I think it looks a lot like this. This is Vajrayogini. So this is what we are supposed to visualize ourselves as. And again, we've talked about gender in Buddhism many times, and here it shows up again. It shows up almost every class. And so we are thinking of ourselves as this female figure. And if you might be wondering why, it doesn't explicitly tell us, but I think there's sort of a, again, if our teacher is higher in the hierarchy, right, and we're operating in the patriarchy, then we should take the lower position. And it would make sense that there's almost this romantic feeling that gets that closes the gap that often separates people. We get this sort of quasi-romantic thing here. She's gazing longingly at the heart of the teacher, longingly here expressing a sense of impatience to be with the teacher, this being the only source of joy, right? And so this is another comparison we can make. I asked you guys about influences in your life, teachers you've been close to. I don't think anybody, at least that I talked to, talked about a partner, a romantic partner, but this is another teacher, right? Another source of learning in our lives, another important source of learning in our lives. And so we see that explicitly being compared here, right? It's very common to compare the teacher to a parent, right? There's a saying in Chinese where it's like a teacher for a day is a father for a lifetime, something like this, just to show the same point that a teacher is so very formative in our lives. This is a slightly less comfortable comparison, but I think it can be powerful, right? Again, this visualization is trying to build on those feelings and link you to the teacher in the way that Padmasambhava's wife is kind of linking to him. So again, Padmasambhava is sort of what the teacher is supposed to be. He has a few different names, the great guru of Odhyana, Guru Rinpoche. There's a picture of him on page 315 where it shows him in this kind of cloud of inspiring figures. Some of them are bodhisattvas, some of them are historical figures. Kind of an interesting group here. And so that's what this practice is supposed to be, right? We talked about doing this with Tara, kind of building up this whole cloud of enlightened beings and this whole mandala of enlightened beings. Remember that? And that's what we are thinking of here. And in doing so, again, we are turning our teacher from some random person with wants and desires and maybe flaws and other various problems into really a divine figure, right? Into a bodhisattva, into a Buddha, if we dare. And we're also reminded that this is a fast way of achieving enlightenment. It's potentially dangerous because you can get caught up in all sorts of distractions and other problems. But by imagining the end at the beginning, right? By imagining the result of Buddhahood in this very lifetime, it's almost like a dress for the job you want kind of thing, not the job you have. So you're imagining your teacher as this enlightened figure, you're imagining yourself as this enlightened student, and then of course, the rest follows from there. There are 7 branches of this practice. Again, I told you it's sort of list within lists. I'm not going to go over every detail of the list, but you're welcome to read through it. Again, this is the more practical side. The first part of class today, we're doing more narrative. This is the more practice part. The first part is pretty interesting, though. It's a prostration. I don't think I've done prostrations for you guys, have I? I think today is not the day to do them. But do you know what a prostration is? Should we look this up? Maybe that's the best solution here, especially with people over Zoom. So maybe I'll just do this. Buddhist prostration. How to prostrate in Tibetan style. Perfect. So I think I'll keep it muted. I'll just talk to you guys. I have no idea who this guy is. But he's explaining all the things that our reading is saying. I just want to see him do it. So, okay. He has his hands together, right? Kind of like, almost like he's holding something. He touches the top of his head. He touches his throat. He touches his heart. Let's see it again. And then puts his head on the floor and then gets straight up and does it again. And so it might look like a pretty simple practice, right? Have you guys ever seen any practice like this before? This is a familiar thing. What does this remind you of? Oh. So kneeling and bowing, right? Yeah, that's definitely part of Catholicism. Actually, I had a really touching moment. There's a big church near my house. I was just walking by. I forget where I was even going, but I was walking by. And then I saw this old lady. She looked like she was collecting cans. You guys ever seen old ladies collecting cans before? Kind of a type, right? So, and she was doing the sign of the cross in front of the church. And I was like, oh, she's sort of having this moment in front of the church. That's very touching. And then I see this young kid in a hoodie sort of walking by. He's looking all tough and stuff. And then he sees the old lady doing the cross. And then he stops and does the cross. And I was like, whoa, this is just a very, we're all sharing sort of a moment here in front of the church. You know, I was really touched. And so, yeah, I'm glad you're making that connection, right? Why do people do that? Why was the can lady or the hoodie boy, why were they all making the cross in front of the church? What's the point? Mm-hmm. Yeah, symbol of reverence. Yeah, exactly. And so they are showing this reverence to a church, right? To a house of God. We don't see what this guy is prostrating to, but we can imagine there's probably some representation of the Buddha, something like that. We learn a story about prostrating where you can prostrate to your teacher. That's a very common thing to do, actually. And we learn about Milarepa doing it on 319. So this teacher sees Milarepa come in and do some prostration. He's like, oh, you're prostrating in that style. I know that style. Hey, you come over here. Let's talk about this prostration, right? So it's actually a big part of Buddhism, in fact, is to prostrate in front of Buddhas. Yeah, maybe that's enough. And I think I liked Sophie's connection to Catholicism. We could also make a connection to Islam, right? Throughout the day, it's very common to bow down and say prayers, right? And so this process of bowing, I think, it really transcends any particular religion. There's something, on the one hand, you are showing reverence to either a statue or a person or a house of God. On the other hand, what is it doing for me is deeply humbling as well, right? I'm this great professor. I am so big, I am so smart, I know all these things. But if I'm putting myself on the ground, right, I'm showing that I am a low figure, right? I am quite literally with my body expressing my own humility. So there are kind of two different sides to it. Even if we are not showing reverence to anything, right, we can show our own humility in the process too. Okay, very good. And there's also kind of a visualization aspect to it, where what is at the very beginning, visualize you are eliminating 100, then 1,000, then innumerable bodies like your own, or sorry, emanating 1,000 innumerable bodies like your own, as numerous as the particles of dust in the universe. And so there's a sense, even as you do these very corporeal, physical practices, you're doing things with your body, you can still visualize expanded versions of them with your mind. there's another example of that with the offerings part right here, where is this? Yeah, on the next page. With both physically arranged and mentally created offerings. I offer everything in the universe as one vast gesture of offering. So on the one hand, you are being told to make an offering to your teacher, right? It's almost like tuition or something like that, right? You're paying something to the teacher for everything that they're giving to you. That's what Sataprayodita was concerned about. He wanted to make an offering to his teacher, Milarepa. Actually, in Naropa too, he stole the soup to make an offering to his teacher, Milarepa. He also went begging in order to make an offering to his teacher. It's a big part of getting ready to learn, right? Is making an offering. And again, you guys do have to do this. You do have to pay tuition, but it's perhaps not quite as ritualized. You don't get to think about it quite as much as these guys are. And part of it is what you physically have to give, but part of it too is to imagine on top of that. So let's say, I don't have very much. I can offer, a nice cup, and I'll put something nice in the cup. But I could imagine this cup being huge and filled with all the best stuff, right? And so by imagining these things, there's a sense of merit and good karma that is coming from this after making these offerings. And the rest I can go a little more quickly through. The confession is kind of interesting. Have you guys ever had to confess before? Yeah, so that's also a part of, it's really probably every religion, but certainly part of Catholicism as well. And here we see it too. And we're not just confessing to what we did in this life, right? Didn't we talk about all the different bad things you could do once you introduce multiple lives into the equation? We've done all the bad things, right? Again, it's very humbling. And so this is asking you to remember that. An intense shame and regret. Ooh, shame, right? What a nasty thing. I openly confess all my downfalls, harmful deeds, those I remember and those I do not, all the unintentionally negative things I've done in all my lives and samsara from time without beginning. So again, it's asking you to take a step beyond just this life, right? And take responsibility for things you might not even remember doing. And you could think, I don't want to take responsibility for those things. But again, I would point out that there's something kind of powerful here, where you connect yourself with the prisoners, with the lowest of the low, those who have done horrible things that you would never imagine really doing. Here's a chance to feel for those people, right? And recognize that perhaps they're not so different from you. And at the same time, by recognizing that perhaps in a previous life, I might have been engaged in this sort of thing, we can still make a vow to not do it again, right? What does it say here? In the luminous Dharmakaya, I confess all wrong thoughts, words, and deeds. And then the next part is to rejoice in all the good stuff I've done, right? So it's to recognize all the bad stuff I've done, to celebrate all the good stuff I've done. And then asking the Buddhas to kind of teach more and to stick around and to not go into enlightenment. And then finally, there's a dedication of merit, which is kind of an interesting part too, where it basically says, if you ever do anything good, you got to make sure you dedicate the merit, and that makes it even better. And we get some kind of weird stories to illustrate that point. I wrote in the notes somewhere, weird story. I forget where I wrote that. I think it was a little further down. But in any case, yeah, so these are the 7 branches of this offering section. Again, it's sort of it's a list within a list, but just so we're not too confused. There's this visualization aspect, then you make these offerings, prostrations, physical offerings, confessions, rejoicing, all of that sort of stuff. And then finally, there's a prayer, a dedication, and this is where the attainments finally come, right? It's all been sort of leading up to this moment where we are finally imagining our perfect teacher above our head. And it's called an empowerment, but it's effectively taking on the teacher's mind, right? We've sort of created this image of a perfect enlightened teacher in our mind. And then we are taking it onto ourselves and what does it say? Fully merge your own mind completely with the teacher's mind and remain in that state. So again, when we compare this to something like Headspace, for example, it's a very different exercise. Both could be said to be meditation, but this is much more involved, right? And it's also deeply integrated into the rest of your life. I think that's part of the power of this exercise is here's the teacher, right? This is a real guy. You might have seen his picture, actually. It's on the front of the reading or the second section of the reading. So this is Dilgo Chense Rinpoche. He died in 1991. I can show you his dates here. They're covered. And then this is one of his students, Dzongsa Chense Rinpoche, who is a very famous monk now. He's not as young as he was in this picture. This must have been taken in the 80s or maybe the very early 90s. But he's actually a film director, Dzongsa Chense Rinpoche. He directed The Cup and Travelers and Magicians. I don't know if you guys know those films. He has a new film coming out, I think just this week, maybe 2 days from now. He has some film premiere that I'm going to try to see. So anyways, but it goes to show, unlike the Chara meditation, which stays sort of abstract, sort of separate from what you can see, feel, and do, right? Here is the teacher, the perfect teacher, the enlightened teacher, holding the hand of the disciple. And by incorporating these enlightened ideals, I would argue there's something that even more powerful that can happen here, right? We talked a bit about abuse earlier, right? And how that can be a part of this relationship. And that happens, right? I don't want to sort of whitewash this and pretend like nothing wrong can happen when you basically deify a teacher. But I think something kind of amazing can happen too, right? Particularly if that teacher is trustworthy. So I'll leave you to sort out, what is good and what is bad. That is not for me to decide for you. But what I think is useful in thinking about in this exercise, it ties into the Tibetan word for Buddha. The Tibetan word for Buddha is Sangye, and each of those syllables means something. Sang means to purify, and Gye means to expand. And this is something I think about a lot because it's not totally clear why that is the case, honestly. But these are my thoughts. What this practice is asking you to do is to expand your sense of self, right? Just like you expand your sense of self in order to connect with Tara, right? Here we are expanding our sense of self to connect with the teacher. And, when I'm kind of a young idiot and I don't know how to do things and I don't know anything about enlightenment, it is perhaps helpful to create someone, regardless of whether they really are perfect or not. We can create someone who is perfect for us, right? And then they can be this separate perfect being. We can kind of cultivate that sense of a perfect being. They teach us things and maybe they get even better as time goes by, right? And eventually the time will come where we can kind of merge our sense of self with that perfect teacher, right? Identify with that perfect teacher. But it has to start as someone separate. And in this case, it's a living separate person, which makes it all the more powerful. So what are we doing here? We're expanding our sense of self and then in the process also purifying our sense of self. So I even made a slide to kind of summarize these ideas that we've covered today. So how do you follow a spiritual friend? That's what we started with, right? You examine the person. And again, this is key because if you pick someone who's bad, you're going to be in trouble. You don't want to merge your sense of self with someone who's bad, right? Again, if you've ever been in a bad relationship, you probably already know that, right? So you don't want to, you need to examine the teacher and make sure they're a good teacher. Follow them. Again, it's kind of illustrating these stories. How should you follow them? With great devotion, with great dedication, right? And then eventually emulate them. Try to act the same way that they act, right? And again, especially if you have created this image of a perfect person and you can think, what would my teacher do in this situation? Again, myself as a teacher, I'm not a perfect person. I try to be good to you guys. I try to be good in this class. I try to present myself as best as I can. But I have all kinds of flaws. I do all sorts of stupid things all the time, right? So, but you probably have a nice image of me as being knowledgeable because you get to see this knowledgeable side of me once a week, right? And so anyways, we can create this sense of a knowledgeable, enlightened person and begin to emulate that person, regardless of whether that's who they really are, to be honest. That's what it means to develop pure perception, right? Is to see your teacher as a Buddha, as an enlightened person. Come to see your teacher as a Buddha. You listen, think, practice. That wasn't explicitly laid out in the reading for today, but that's kind of a classic scholastic formula where you listen to your teacher, you think about it, and then you put it into practice. And then finally, we get into this last part where you're doing the prostrations and making offerings, other dedications. This is to gain good karma, right? To kind of put your mind in a good space, to make yourself humble, to purify. Again, this idea of purify and expand. So this would be the purify part. And then you can finally expand and try to merge your sense of self with the teacher. So that's basically the path here, right? We've talked about the Eightfold Path as one way to achieve enlightenment. This is a very different path to enlightenment, right? But this is one built around an enlightened teacher. And figures like the Dalai Lama really embody this. So again, we started this class thinking, why do Tibetan Buddhists love the Dalai Lama so much? It's an active process, right? They together build him as the Bodhisattva of compassion. And so when they see him, they are interacting with the Bodhisattva of compassion. And he knows how to play that role. Maybe you can tell from the way I'm talking about this, it doesn't really matter if he really is or really is not, right? That's how the world treats him. The world makes him into the Bodhisattva of compassion, and he knows how to be that. And I don't mean to say that that's any small skill, right? I could not do it. I don't think so. I've never tried, I guess, but I would not want to. That's a lot of pressure, right? That's a lot of pressure. So he's pretty amazing to be able to put up with that pressure. And if we come back to this, I don't know why I thought of this meme, but for some reason I did. Me in the theater at age 12, silently becoming an entirely different person over the course of 90 minutes as I download my new personality from the coolest character in the movie. I don't know if this is relatable to you, but for some reason that sort of spoke to me, right? Sometimes when I see a movie, especially when I was a kid, when I see a movie, there's some character who's sort of appealing. And I think when I found this meme, someone was talking about Rick and Morty, right? It's even more powerful when you see a character over and over and over again, right? Like when I was a kid, The Simpsons was really popular. So like Bart Simpson, even though he was a little hellion, there's something very sort of charming about him where you could sort of be a hellion, but then sort of be hilarious and be charming all at the same time. And I think all of these characteristics did get baked into me a little bit, right? So when you're exposed to a certain way of being over and over and over and over again, it does kind of leach into you a little bit. And so I made sort of a sassy little slide here comparing, okay, here's this spiritual friend practice. What do we do, right? And again, I'm not pointing fingers at you. I'm more pointing them at myself, to be honest. We scroll, we follow, we emulate. The follow is exactly the same, right? You can even follow. There's a follow button for so many social media things. We develop an online persona that will attract likes and followers, right? And so in a way, we are building up this persona not on a teacher, right? Not on someone external, but kind of on ourselves. And this is, again, I think it's part of this difficult dissonance that we all have to deal with, right? It's being our online selves and then being our self selves, our real selves, all at the same time. They don't always line up. I think some people maybe are a bit more coherent than others, but they don't always line up. And this is actually, I think, causes problems for some people. We need to produce content, right, that reflects that persona and maybe gain more followers, right? The world needs content. If you don't make any content, you're not going to get any likes. And then maybe if you're really good, you might even profit. Now, the merging part is interesting, right? Because in the end, here we're merging sort of our imperfect sense of self, our impure sense of self with a more pure sense of self. What is being merged here? I don't really know. Are we merging our own sense of self with the online persona, which is kind of a crafted one, and trying to reconcile those differences and try to be that perfect persona that we craft? Maybe. Are we merging with the influencers that we follow, right? And trying to learn from them, all the hilarious tweets that I see, right? It's like, am I trying to somehow take on that way of thinking, that way of acting, that way of commenting, and utilizing that in my own life? Am I trying to take on those personalities as well? Or is something else happening altogether? I don't know. I think these are all questions that I was just sort of flirting with as I was preparing for class. But the reason I made this slide though is to show, even though this feels a little outlandish, this idea like creating some perfect teacher and then merging with them. Why would you ever do that? That's such a weird thing to do. We do it all the time. We do it every day, right? Every day we get on the internet. We are merging, we are changing, we are crafting. And so I think the more attention we bring to this, the more powerful we will be in the process, right? You know, when we were 12 years old, when I was 12 years old, Kylie Jenner was being born. Didn't I say that earlier? Yeah, right? Kylie Jenner was being born, and there was no social media, right? It was more one unidirectional. It was basically, there's the TV, I listen, I watch, I take, right? Now we have some power to create, to influence, and to sort of spread our own ideas out in the world too. So it's a little more bi-directional, at least more than it used to be. And so this, you know, I'm not trying to say we need to take this model on. Like I was saying, I don't want the pressure of being some sort of perfect being. So please don't put that on me. I'm going to be imperfect. Thank you very much. But at the same time, I think there is something useful here, right? Which is, again, creating a perfect being and then learning to take that on to ourselves, right, when we're ready to do that. That's what I see happening here. And that's something, it's a theme we will continue to see when we read Novice to Master. Something very similar happens. So, okay, that was a lot of lecture for this last part, but we're right on time. Look at that. So any last questions before we call it a night? We all good? All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of spiritual friends. So have a good week. Welcome back from the break. I know this is a long class to welcome you back with. Like I said, exam next week, and let's have a review session Friday. I'll send you an email about it. So I'll see you all again on Friday if you